It's now 183,117 miles since we have been performing service and maintenance procedure on the 2004 Nissan Frontier. So what I want to show you is I've replaced that scan tool that was stolen from us in Guyana so we could continuously monitor engine performance. And what I want you to know is, since that scan tool was missing and detached from the vehicle, the dash cluster never display a check engine light again. But when I connect this scan tool and I look for a code, you can see we're getting DTC 328. This is in the freeze frame for the ECU and is not a code in real time. But what I want to show you is when you look at the ECT temperature in Fahrenheit, you're going to notice our engine is maintaining approximately 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, and currently it's locked in at 185 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is below factory temperature, which is normally 210, 230 degrees Fahrenheit. That's because the thermostat opens at a higher temperature. In the video description, you're going to see a lot more information that you need to know that is being discussed in this video. So what's currently being experienced with the vehicle right now is not a drivability issue or a starting problem or any problem that you will normally have with driving. What's happening is the engine is beginning to get louder. Once it gets warm, or I should say hot. So when you take a look at starting the vehicle when it's cold, it will operate smooth with no noise or clicking or rattling from the internals. As the temperature increases to where we're at right now, approximately 185 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to start hearing a clicking, clacking, a rattling sound from the engine. But the engine will continue to perform as it normally would. This noise is most likely to happen in the valve train, since the vehicle is high mileage at 183,000 miles. Now you would already know by looking at previous video that this Nissan Vg33e V6 engine is equipped with hydraulic lifters for the valve train. This is like a dampener device to keep the valve train running smooth and prevent that clicking and clacking, rattling noise that we're going to hear later on in the video. So when you start hearing this noise, this clicking, rattling noise, you're going to want to make sure you're getting oil pressure. So you're going to want to look at the oil light on the dash cluster, making sure it's not on. And you're going to want to also have your mechanic physically attach a mechanical oil pressure gauge to the oil filter fitting. Most vehicles will have one. So you could get a manual readout of the oil pressure that the oil pump is producing at idle when the engine is hot. It's most critical. Most of the time the oil pressure will be where it should be, and that noise, clicking and rattling in the valve train, will still exist. So like I said, is the hydraulic lifter collapsing. What's happening is inside of the hydraulic lifter is not able to contain and hold the engine oil for maintaining pressure against the plunger to keep the rocker arm, the camshaft, and the top of the valve stem with a zero clearance no matter the temperature. Inside the hydraulic lifter, It's most likely a spring and a ball, a metal ball like you will find in a ball bearing. So that ball has to cover a orifice to control the oil flow based on the pressure of the spring being applied at high RPM on the valve train. Valve train technology and ideology is very confusing, and it may take years for you to understand. But studying valve trains, you're going to have to consult with automotive books to truly understand how the valve trainers work. But most valve train in today's car are equipped with hydraulic lifters. So once you see a car that has high mileage and you start hearing that rattling like a box of marble in the engine once it gets hot, no matter if it's at idle or engine speed, in drive, you're gonna hear that noise, you will know that's hydraulic lifters. Now, we're only assuming that it's hydraulic lifters because once we take that rocker cover, that valve cover off, and we start cleaning down there, getting all that sludge out, taking inspection of the cam lobes, the tip of the valve train, valve stem, and also looking at the rocker arm and the plunger for the hydraulic lifter, we want to make sure we don't have any excessive wear and tear, which is not likely the case if you're getting oil pressure. But you will get a noisy valve train with good oil pressure once the hydraulic lifter fails to maintain its maximum extent pressure against the valve train for zero clearance at all temperature.
A gasoline engine should not sound like this diesel truck. That's what the failed hydraulic lifter sounds like.
So we can now see we have 183,157 miles, and the temperature is at normal, recording at approximately 190 degrees, and that temperature is dropping. So now we want to take a look at the engine now that we're at stop and listen to how this gasoline engine will now sound like a diesel engine with all the rattling sound. This is where we're going to have to take a look at the timing belt tensioner or the hydraulic lifter, like I stated before. Tomorrow morning, when the engine is cold, we're going to take another startup and listen to the engine operation, making sure that it does not make this rattling noise. Once it warms up, this is what we're going to hear, and that will give us a sign that it's most likely a hydraulic lifter. If the hydraulic lifter is to be the problem, you will notice a loss in acceleration and fuel consumption will increase. But before we could take apart that rocker cover, that valve cover, we want to remove the timing belt cover and check the timing belt tensioner bearing, because that is sometimes most likely to cause that noise also. But most likely it will be in the hydraulic lifter. Okay, it's now early in the morning and we could see the temperature is cold, so we want to start the engine and listen for that noise again. So as you can see, the noise is not apparent. Now when we look at our engine RPM and temperature, so we can see our temperature is still cold and the RPM is a little above 1000. And we do not have that clicking noise now that the engine is cold. So what's happening here is, since the engine is cold, all the metal parts are sealed. As the engine gets hot, those parts, the clearance between the parts, the hydraulic lifter, the internals, will increase, and that will start causing that clicking, clacking sound. So we're going to continue with the engine operating until we can hear that noise start getting louder. So what I want to do here now is I want to set up my scan tool, because I want to look at the temperature. So we can see ECT temperature is at 113 degrees, and we want to look at the RPM. So you can see the RPM is approximately 975. Now as the RPM dropped to approximately 650, the engine temperature will increase to approximately 180, 190 degree, and then we're going to listen for that sound. So I want to move the accelerator so we could hear that noise a little. You hear it? That's the camshaft hydraulic lifter. So with the noise gaining, we can start hearing coming into play. I'm going to use this Stp Oil Treatment, help protects against engine wear. And what this is going to do, it's going to help us reduce that knocking. You can start hearing it increase as the engine temperature increase. So you can see our engine temperature right now is at 152. So by placing this additive inside the engine oil, it's going to allow to suppress that noise and reduce, not reduce, but it's going to give more viscosity to the oil to protect against friction and wear. Now we can hear the hydraulic lifters beginning to rattle as the engine oil and its temperature increase. You can see now we're at 160. So you can hear the lifters rattling from the sudden acceleration drop. at RPM is almost 800. It should be around 650. So we're gonna wait for the RPM to drop as engine temperature increase to listen for this hydraulic lifter noise to become more loud. Then when we take a look inside of the vehicle, we can see our temperature is up into the median and the RPM is a little above where it should be. So here we could listen, and we could hear that rattling as the temperature is now up to where it should be, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And the RPM is approximately 800. So you can hear the rattling as the acceleration begins to drop. That's telling us it's the hydraulic lifter. So now we have to take off this upper intake manifold, secure the wiring harness and all the spark plug wire, removing these two valve covers and gaining access to the valve trim. In the video description, you're going to see there's a video link on how to complete this whole procedure by removing the upper intake system, replacing its gasket, cleaning the inside of the valve cover, removing its valve trim, hydraulic lifter, replacing the valve stems. All these things should be done at one service. Most of the time, you might need the valve stem seal replaced because the exhaust tailpipe will produce a white smoke, or the hydraulic lifter will start to rattle at high mileage like we're experiencing here. So whichever situation should hit you first, you will always want to make sure you do a complete valve trim service procedure, and that is replacing the valve stem seal, replacing the valve spring, the inner and outer spring, replacing the hydraulic lifter, taking careful inspection of the camshaft, lobes and specification, making sure they maintain factory recommendation clearance. Also replacing of the gasket, but it's very important when you're in that valve cover that you replace the valve spring, the valve stem seal, and the hydraulic lifters, paying attention to the rocker arm, making sure there's no excessive clearance to create this rattling noise. So this can also be that oil is not getting up into the upper valve trim, causing the hydraulic lifter to remain unpressured, and that's what will cause that clacking sound. So what could cause oil pressure to not get up into the valve trim? Well, maybe the passageway could be clogged by sludge. With the engine still hot, I just want to pour this STP into the engine oil, and you can see how thick it is. This is what's going to preserve the engine from any excessive wear and tear. And we're going to try again tomorrow morning, or when the engine gets cool, to restart to see if the valve trim noise becomes suppressed by this Stp oil treatment. Now, to further diagnose this problem, which may sometimes appear to be from one of the bearing on the drive belt pulley system, either could be the water pump, the alternator, the power steering, or that idler pulley, you're going to want to take those belts off and restart the engine, allowing just that crankshaft pulley to spin when the engine is operating, to make sure that your rattling noise or growling noise or any noise is not coming from the serpentine belt drive system, which is the pulleys, what you see in front here. Also, you have to take into consideration the timing belt tensioner pulley bearing could also be making a noise similar to what we are hearing. But since we have diagnosed this problem using the engine temperature from hot to cold and noticing that the noise is not there when the engine is cold, only hot, it will lead us to believe that it's coming from the hydraulic lifter, since that part is associated with temperature and oil. Okay, it's now early in the morning and we could see the temperature is cold. So we want to start the engine and listen for that noise again. So as you can see, the noise is not apparent. Now when we look at our engine RPM and temperature, so we can see our temperature is still cold and the RPM is a little above 1000, and we do not have that clicking noise now that the engine is cold. So what's happening here is, since the engine is cold, all the metal parts are sealed. As the engine gets hot, those parts, the clearance between the parts, the hydraulic lifter, the internals, will increase, and that will start causing that clicking, clacking sound. So we're going to continue with the engine operating until we can hear that noise start getting louder. So what I want to do here now is I want to set up my scan tool, because I want to look at the temperature. So we can see ECT temperature is at 113 degrees, and we want to look at the RPM. So you can see the RPM is approximately 975. Now as the RPM dropped to approximately 650, the engine temperature will increase to approximately 180, 190 degree, and then we're going to listen for that sound. So I want to move the accelerator so we could hear that noise a little. You hear it? That's the camshaft hydraulic lifter. Okay, now you will probably be asking the question, what will happen if I continue driving the vehicle with this rattling noise from the valve train? Well, what will happen is that noise will continue to get louder, and eventually the valve train is just going to become destructive, and like I said, it's going to get so loud to the point where the engine, the vehicle, is going to lose power during acceleration. Also, the engine will consume excess or extra fuel since the valves are not opening all the way. You will also notice that there's a loss in power, but this loss in the power is not when the engine is at the top of the RPM, because you have to understand at the top of the RPM is where the oil pump is driving the oil for maximum pressure, and this will help build the hydraulic lifter body to extend to its maximum limit for opening the valve where it should, but still it's not adequate enough for suppressing the noise. So it is best to replace the component under the valve cover, which is the hydraulic lifter, the valve springs, the valve stem seal, and taking a careful inspection of the rocker arm and its pedestal, making sure there's no excessive wear and tear to continue the noise. Also, before disassembling the valve train under the valve cover, you're going to want to make sure that you clean the valve train completely clean, removing all the sludge from around the springs and wherever they may be. In the video description, you're going to see how we've done it. The reason you want to clean this valve train first before you disassemble it is that you don't want any sludge or contaminant to enter the passageway for the oil of the hydraulic lifters and where it needs to lubricate the valve train. So you have to be very careful once you take all those parts apart and put them aside. You don't want any contamination to get down into the oil galleys, because when you're going to be reassembling your valve train, if those contaminant and blockage remain down in the oil galley, you will have the same problem because it will block the oil flow from getting into the hydraulic lifters, and this will cause the hydraulic lifter to not build pressure, and then you will have the same sound. So in the future video, I will have a presentation on how to replace the hydraulic lifters. They're approximately $20 each. So you want to make sure they are genuine Nissan hydraulic lifters. You don't want to go to aftermarket because you don't know what you're dealing with. Nissan is the best. So this is going to bring us to the end of this video. And in our next video, we're going to take a look at replacing those hydraulic lifters. But for now, you could go to the video description and look at the video links below, and you will see how to remove all those components to gain access to the hydraulic lifter for replacement, reducing and getting rid of that noise. That noise will make your vehicle sound like it's 25 years old, and that's the noise you're going to hear on a lot of Toyota, Nissan, Honda, a lot of gasoline engine. That rattling noise that makes the gasoline engine sound like a diesel engine. Well, that sound is coming from the hydraulic lifters and the valve train rocker arm slapping around. It's now 183,207 miles since we started our testing and diagnostic of that engine noise. Now, it might be hard for you to see that odometer reading because you have to understand everything is made of plastic, and plastic is not the best material. So let's listen to this engine. So we can still hear that knocking. It's not a knocking, it's just a clicking from the lifter. And what it might be is one or two hydraulic lifter that's making this clacking noise. So once the top of the engine has been disassembled, then it will be easier to find that specific lifter that's making the noise. But it's always best to just replace all the hydraulic lifters. Some people say you could take the lifters apart and clean them and they will restore to their proper function. But let's listen to the engine again. Since we have added that Stp Oil Treatment for adding viscosity to the engine oil to maintain a seal chamber inside the hydraulic lifter so that oil does not bleed down, causing this rattling. So we can still hear that noise, and this means we have to replace those parts. The oil treatment, like I said, is to suppress any engine damage, and since the valve train is slapping around, you want to suppress that knocking or that slapping, rattling noise, because if it continues, what's going to happen is it's going to increase the clearance between the valve stem and the rocker arm, where the rocker arm sits on its pedestal, also between the hydraulic lifter and the rocker arm. Careful attention has to be taken. You don't want to drive the vehicle too much. You want to make sure you change these lifters, because you have to understand it's going to affect fuel efficiency and horsepower performance. Okay, so before we come to a conclusion, the noise in the two valve covers will most likely be suppressed by adding a few container of this Stp oil. In our case, we have added approximately 2 of this container. But before we did so, most of the time you're going to do an oil change. And at 183,000 miles, you're going to want to use a 50 weight oil in tropical weather condition, and also change the oil filter, because failure to change the oil filter will eventually cause a restriction in its filter element, reducing oil pressure to the upper half of the engine, which is the valve train, contributing to that rattling noise inside the hydraulic lifter and increasing the wear and tear factor of the valve train, reducing the engine life expectancy or performance longevity. Now, before we get involved in replacing parts, gaskets, and labor, we always want to try simple methods, and that will always be able to use fluid and additive from the automotive petroleum industry to render small problems like this. For example, in previous video, we also showed you a cleaning additive that can be used for cleaning the upper valve train and the engine internals, for clearing those oil galley passageway, for promoting oil into the hydraulic lifters and all its friction parts. Also, the piston rings is another important part, because you don't want the piston rings to become frozen in the groove, and this will cause a loss of compression. But that's a totally different case than what we're discussing here. What we're discussing here is hydraulic lifters. So this is what we have done: replace the oil filter, and adding a few container of this Stp oil treatment. Now, you have to understand, if you're going to add 2 of this container or 1 of this container, you're going to have to subtract that out of the oil that's going to be added into the crankcase. You do not want to overfill the engine crankcase, because this is going to cause the crankshaft to whip the oil inside the crank sump into foam and mostly oil bubble, and that will eventually get up into the valve train, into the oil galley, and this will cause an increase in wear and tear factor to the engine parts, which is critical for preventing wear and tear. Here's a cutaway of a hydraulic lifter for a General Motors 2.3 liter V6 engine. The concept is identical to the Nissan, but what I want you to get here is that where we're having this problem is right here, where this ball seats and these 2 springs. Sometimes one of the springs could break and cause that slapping noise, or also, since the valve train has been operating for such a long time, in some case this ball will fail to perfectly seat on that passageway, and it will allow oil to just seep, and preventing the plunger from building pressure against the camshaft. In this case, a push rod will be sitting here, and that push rod will connect to the camshaft lube, to the rocker arm, I mean. So the bottom here, the follower, will be onto the camshaft, but it's the same concept. So that's what's going on with a hydraulic lifter. And you can also see in the side here, there's an oil galley that brings the oil in, where these 2 springs are. And these 2 springs balance this plunger with the oil pressure when the engine is running. And as the valve train should push down on the plunger in the event of acceleration, rapid acceleration, the ball will be able to move, allowing oil pressure to continuously build in the plunger, preventing the plunger from slapping back and forth like we are experiencing in the Nissan engine. So that's the general concept of understanding